All right, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed that networking break. I have the pleasure of announcing our quiz winners from yesterday, Ishwar, Kavinya, Shagufta. Congratulations. Thank you for engaging with the Smart Protein quiz contest and everything that we've been putting up. I'm very excited to welcome you all to this next panel, which is very close to me personally, as well as all the work that we do at GFI India. We've said many times that we are focused on locating the alternative protein or the smart protein industry within the context of the developing world. And you can't separate that task from the question of nourishing 1/6 of the world's population by the year 2050 in India, but also the question of tackling key problems like farmers' welfare and malnutrition, which we're going to talk about on this panel. The three panelists that we have are experts on this and are deploying fantastic, really world-changing technology towards trying to tackle this problem. And it's not just technology, it's also about communities and people, as we're going to see. So really quickly, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Taylor Quinn from Tailored Food. Taylor has been the Emerging Markets Director at Eat Just, which Josh Tetrick, the founder of Eat Just, was our keynote speaker earlier on day one. Taylor was Just's Emerging Markets Director for 5 years before spinning out his work into a social enterprise, Tailored Food. He's done a lot of things across the food and nutrition landscape. He moved to Liberia during the Ebola outbreak in 2015, used his background as a food anthropologist and social entrepreneur to build and launch a Liberian-owned and operated business that produces nutritious, low-cost, delicious food, targeting consumers living in extreme poverty. Since then, he has also taken this nutritious, low-cost, plant-based food to work in 10 countries and into new product categories, ranging from plant-based ground beef in Brazil to banana leaf wrapped snack bars in the Congo. Taylor is dedicated to designing and implementing nutritious, low-cost, plant-based food solutions all over the world, and we're very happy to have him here with us today on day 5 of the Smart Protein Summit. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you, Varun.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Michelleegger. Michelle is co-founder and CEO of BioMilk, a biotechnology startup creating human breast milk, but outside the body. She recently earned her MBA from Duke University, has a Bachelor of Science in Food Science from Purdue. During her time with General Mills, Michelle worked on dairy fermentation, formulation, and processing, and on finding ways to improve dairy products globally, everywhere from US school cafeterias to processing plants in Ethiopia. Michelle also worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on their global nutrition team shortly thereafter, where she explored strategies to create affordable plant-based protein sources for low and middle-income countries by collaborating with startups and suppliers and me. We worked together on a project when she was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And finally, I'm introducing Jim Laird. Jim is the CEO and co-founder of 3F Bio, a mycoprotein fermentation-focused company. 3F Bio's purpose is to make protein sustainable, and the company addresses this by growing Abunda mycoprotein, an existing advantaged ingredient with an established market role, more sustainably and at a lower cost than all other protein options. Jim has 30 years experience in food with roles for Unilever, PepsiCo, and Premier Foods, and is motivated by the combination of innovation, biotechnology, and collaboration to create sustainable, large-scale food solutions. Michelle and Jim, welcome. Thank you so much for being at the Smart Protein Summit.
Thanks, delighted to be here.
All right, let's dive right in. I have a round of questions about the fascinating work that each of you do. Taylor, I'll start with you. At Eat Just, you focused on using these delicious, nutritious, plant-based foods as a means of targeting malnutrition in the developing world. And now you're doing the same across many more countries with your independent work. Could you tell us a little bit more about these projects? I spoke about them during your introduction, but could you tell us more about them and how you got into them?
Yeah, thanks, Varun. Hi, everyone. And so I'm Taylor, and I joined Eat Just back in 2015 when it was a bit smaller of a company than it is today. And I was immersed in the world of Silicon Valley and food technology. And back in the early days of Just, it was also much earlier days for Beyond Meat and Impossible. We were all smaller companies. And I saw the really exciting innovation happening. But at the same time, I was living most of my time in a country in West Africa called Liberia. And it was about 2/3 of the way through the Ebola outbreak that hit West Africa back in 2014, 2015. And I saw that there was such a dichotomy between where the best minds, our best technologists, our best chefs were thinking about food products for markets like the US. But then at the same time, hundreds, thousands of kids that I was interacting with every day in Liberia were dying of malnutrition, and all the nonprofit organizations that do work in the food and nutrition space were addressing weren't addressing the root cause of the problem. They were offering nutritious food products when a child was already sick, but they weren't asking the question, hey, why isn't nutritious food available in local markets? So this kind of core truth hit me really hard after meeting with a pediatrician at the hospital hardest hit by malnutrition in Liberia. So in March 2016, I became obsessed with the question of, hey, what would it look like to design and take to market nutritious, low-cost, plant-based food products in countries like Liberia? And 2 years of a lot of trial and error in Liberia, and I can get into that later. But after 2 years in partnership with a local business, I set up Kawada Farms. We launched a line of nutritious flavored porridge products made with ingredients like wild palm, cassava, sugarcane, coconut, sesame seed into the Liberian market. And those products have now been sold for over 2.5 years. And the key to this work is how do you build a business that's not only designing and taking to market really nutritious, low-cost food products, but how do you do that at, most importantly, a profit for the local business and at a price point that's accessible to the poorest of the poor? So, you know, my philosophy is that can you take these new smart protein products into the market, starting at the bottom of the price pyramid, rather than starting at the top and hoping that pricing will, over time, funnel down. My belief is that, you know, in certain countries at certain income levels, you actually have to design for equity from day one, rather than hoping that you're eventually going to get to a price point that's eventually going to become cheap enough. Because the way we designed had to be different from day one if we wanted to get to that ultimate price point in Liberia, which was 6 cents a meal, in Congo today with our cassava-based snack bar, or in Brazil, we're designing from day one for consumers living in poverty.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and really great insights, Taylor. Thank you. Michelle, biomilk is really doing some stuff that's kind of like science fiction. You're making that a reality. You're using cell culture to try and solve a major problem in the global nutrition landscape, breastfeeding in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. Why did you choose this problem? Could you frame the problem, and how does biomilk tackle it?
Yeah, well, it kind of comes back to where my core passion has always been, as both in my career and my personal life, which has been feeding others and seeing others thrive through better nutrition and better health. And I'm not a mom, which surprises a lot of people. I don't work on this issue because I had a challenge with breastfeeding myself. I hope to be a mom someday, but at this point, I haven't experienced it. But the importance of the first 1,000 days of life really sets the nutritional path of a child for the rest of their life into adolescence and adulthood. And so we can't really ignore that it doesn't really make sense to intervene at a point where a child's 3 years old, 5 years old, like Taylor mentioned. I mean, you look at when a child's already sick, already experiencing stunting or wasting, and it's too late in many ways. A lot of the time you see just amazingly bright children that have been trapped in a stunted body, and because of it won't really ever catch up. And so through a number of different experiences I had, it started to become clear to me that we really had to think upstream. And especially with my time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where the theory of change we were talking about was looking at all the way to childbearing aged women, to mothers considering becoming pregnant, trying to get better nutrition to them so that they could then birth healthier babies. Really was the first time that I thought to myself, gosh, why are we trying to intervene when somebody's in school? We have to think before they've even arrived on this planet, how are we going to make sure that they have the nutrition that they need to thrive? And so similar to Taylor, I use the word obsessed because I went from, wow, it would be kind of cool to obsessed with infant nutrition, and thinking that that's really a place in this world where we see a lot of struggle, both culturally, societally, socioeconomically. And it's a really fascinating and important part of development for a child. So biomilk, we really believe, we can get the full nutritional profile of breast milk outside of the body. We can unlock that macro and micronutrient profile, the perfect constellation of breast milk. And we may not be able to deliver everything, may not be able to be immunologically relevant the way a mother's milk would be for different parts of the world, but we can do a heck of a lot better than cow's milk, which is what most moms have to turn to today, and really get children the basis of nutrition they need to avoid stunting, wasting, and over or under nutrition, which we see all stemming back to some extent to breastfeeding and the nutrition they receive in the beginning of life.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And it's worth noting that India specifically has some of the highest cohort rates of malnutrition for a lot of those things that you just described: iron deficiency anemia, the attendant stunting, the attendant wasting, really tragic, debilitating conditions like neural tube defects, etc. So it's really important work, and I hope that we can think through ways in which it can come to market faster and scale really quickly as well. Jim, 3F Bio takes a process that has been harnessed for millennia, fermentation, and utilizes it to get abundant, sustainable, nutritious mycoprotein. Could you tell us more about that mission and how this process works?
Yeah, thanks, Varun. And firstly, congratulations to you and the team. A phenomenal conference and really energizing this need for more healthy, sustainable, and a just food system. Within the description of the panel, you asked, will malnutrition hamper our ability to shape our destiny? And clearly the only current answer to that question is it already is, and it's doing so today. You've shared the data with me that highlights the scale of the problem in India, and according to the FAO data in 2018, 196 million people undernourished. So it's hampering the shape of our destiny. 15% of the population and more than a third of under fives underweight. So the obvious follow-up is that we do need to look for solutions, and we need to use technology, and for me, more specifically, technologies which are available now to tackle what remains one of the decade's major challenges. And so the collective purpose of 3F Bio is to make protein sustainable. And by doing so, we want to make a positive impact on both the environment and on global nutrition. We'll only do this by making great food that consumers love. And therefore we address it by growing mycoprotein. It's an existing and advantaged ingredient. It's got an established role, as you just said, and we do so more sustainably and at lower cost than any of the other protein options, such that it can really have an impact at scale. And to give a flavor of what we do, we convert any fermentable sugar source into a whole food using large-scale aerobic fermentation. And we've got some IP that lets us do it efficiently, because any of the waste of the fermentation process, we pass over the fence into another process to make into a biorefinery, and therefore it's fully recovered. So that driver for low cost has to be at the heart of what we do. And we do it with grains such as wheat or maize, but equally, and I think very importantly, also any starch source. So rice, cassava, we've moved to sugarcane as well to exemplify, is any locally grown feedstock can make a whole biomass. In terms of our timescale and plan, our first facility is going to be in Europe. It's operational in 2022. It'll be located in the south of the Netherlands, and we see that facility growing to about 50,000 tons per year by 2027. And I guess the real inspiring fact for me, and the fact that makes us want to run faster every day, is even those numbers are large, 50,000 tons, it accounts for an absolute fraction, about 2% of the growth that is needed in this market for non-animal protein. So we love your headline of moving from scarcity to abundance. We hope to be one part of that jigsaw, and that helps achieve that by revolutionizing the way that we grow protein more efficiently.
Thank you, Jim. And I think it won't be lost on the audience that we have sort of representatives from 3 of the pillars of alternative proteins here. So Taylor sort of representing plant-based, Michelle representing kind of cell culture, animal cell culture. Actually, in Michelle's case, human mammary cell culture. And then Jim with fermentation, which is fast emerging as this third pillar. Even though, Jim, of course, you've been working on this for a long time, it's gaining cognizance and increased attention as the third pillar of alternative proteins. It also will not have been lost on anyone, especially our panel, that the World Food Programme won the Nobel Peace Prize yesterday for getting nutrients to people in under-resourced settings. Yes, thank you. At GFI India, this is what this panel is about. We're focused on alternative protein technologies becoming a major lever to target malnutrition in the harshest of environments, so that they can become a tool for the World Food Programme as well. How long, Michelle, will it get to take, how long will it take, excuse me, to get the cost of these technologies, let's say cell culture, let's say biomilks work, down to the requisite levels that we can target the lowest income levels in the harshest of environments?
Yeah. Well, first, I have to say, I saw that the World Food Prize or World Food Program won yesterday, which is about 17,000 people won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's really inspiring because I think this work is exhausting. It's really hard to see how slowly we're going for how many people are currently experiencing malnutrition and the effects of it. And so to be able to like get that boost on the back, to be like, we know it's really hard and we know that you're working as fast and as hard as you can. Like, thank you for doing what you do. Being a part of the World Food Program has got to feel pretty darn good yesterday and today. Not that it doesn't always, but I'm glad that the people who are working amazingly hard in this world are getting the acknowledgement they deserve. And to be honest, we can't move fast enough is the answer to your question. It's exciting that you have all three of us as pillars represented, because Taylor and Jim, they're going to have to come earlier than Cell Ag is coming to really intervene. And that's really the true answer. I mean, for us and for most of cellular agriculture, I think we're probably 7 to 10 years before it scales to a place where it'll be even close to affordable in other parts of the world outside of incredibly developed nations with a lot of willingness to pay. And that's because it's not a volume game to start for most of these business models. We're working with very expensive media, which tends to be reagent grade, comes from lab source and pharma, and very, very costly, which everyone's working on bringing down those costs, but it doesn't yet compare to the inputs of feeding cattle or growing soybeans. And it's going to take for most of those companies to even be competitive in other parts of the world, like the US or Europe, probably 5 years minimum to be even viable for a lot of the consumers here based in North Carolina, United States, where I am. But we do see, I think personally, the opportunity to create and combine creative technologies from different sectors to bring some of these technologies more quickly. So Cell Ag is unique in that we can bring in, I'm sure as you guys have talked about much in this conference, we can bring in from pharma, we can bring in from food, we can bring in from bioprocessing. There's all kinds of really amazing technology out there, and it's really getting creative on how you recombine so that you can produce closer to regions that need it. So you're not distributing it all the way around the world, and so that you can have more control outside of a process that doesn't have to happen, on the ground in one place. But because of that, I think the exciting technologies and the work that I had looked at previously in fermentation, in plant-based, that's the stopgap. And in some ways that will be the more important place to begin for a lot of populations for now. Looking at fermentation is much more scalable, much faster. Jim, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think Jim's ambition is to be there in like the next 5 years, probably, to start to expand into these markets. And I know that his passion is there to get it there, and fermentation's capable of that. As a dairy scientist, fermentation expert, what they do is amazing. And the fact that we can take what's essentially waste and convert it into an important nutritional component is mind-blowing, and will definitely be scalable in other parts of the world. And then when you look at Taylor's work, I mean, plant-based is here now. There's incredible nutritional ROI, return on investment of the nutrients that you get. And we look at that there's, crops and pulses, and, we've talked about all kinds of different things that are eaten throughout the world that have incredible nutritional value that we don't yet harness fully. And so being able to take those indigenous crops that already exist, be able to process them in country or near to regions that are experiencing stunting, wasting, truly capture all of the nutritional ROI and get it to populations that need it. I'm kind of hoping that the weight is on the shoulders of my two buddies here on the panel to get there first, so that we can then come, 7-10 years from now and be able to really blow the market out and say, okay, how much earlier can we get? We've been trying to feed at those younger ages. We've been trying to feed at places it's important, but now how do we think about erasing the need for talking about malnutrition in school age kids? How do we move earlier? And I think it's just the important thing to note. And one of the reasons I was so excited to speak to everyone at this conference is I think a lot of people are looking to the West for these technologies. But long term, that's not where these technologies are going to be most successful in unlocking cognitive ability, unlocking growth and change. And so one of the things we're really proud of at BioMilk is, yes, we work on a really cool technology. We're using human mammary epithelial cells. We're making milk, but we could be feeding the generation of the future that solves malnutrition. We're not going to do it alone. And so the idea that we could unlock the cognitive ability of the next brilliant minds that might come up with even better ways to feed the world, that's where I, like, almost tears in my eyes, get really excited and proud that we could possibly, we're not going to be the ones to solve it, but we can possibly nourish the ones who are. So it's an incredible place to be able to work and spend time on in your career path.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to move to Jim now. I know you've basically answered all his questions for him, but I'm going to move to Jim now. And Michelle mentioned, Jim, that with fermentation, 3F Bio already has a relentless focus on getting the cost of high quality protein down to that level where you can serve in any environment at any level of the income pyramid. So let's say you had to do this in India. I know your first facility is in Europe. Let's say you had to do this in India. What would you say are the kind of tweaks or the optimizations necessary to be able to do this?
I think the answer is we have to make protein that addresses this vast market, this 500 million ton market. So it's got to be relevant to India, and it's got to be relevant to every market. The cost of meat and fish is probably in the range of between $3 and $7 to $10 a kilogram. And as such, I think meat from but right now, meat from livestock does dominate this market. I was going to gamble on a chance of sharing a screen, but I'll just talk to the point. This 500 million ton market is in excess of $3 a kilogram. So any solution that we're going to do that replaces the over-reliance on animal as this main source of protein needs to be less than, and maybe substantially less than, this $3 a kilogram. And that's where we're striving. I think if you look at the cost of any protein source, you can look at 4 cost components. It's got feedstock costs, utilities, labor costs, and cost of capital. And if we look at our technology, feedstock's about 1/3 of our cost, and cost of capital is another 1/3. And for me, it's a very viable solution, and but only works best as a collaborative model. We're working with all the parts of the ecosystem, including government, some of the very large engineering companies and CPG companies, and also the likes of GFI and CIFF, who are also motivated to explain why this works. I guess to come to the economics, our 2 biggest cost components are feedstock. And I think your question, if we look at India, is there locally grown fermentable crops that are eminently suitable for this? And the answer is 100% yes. So there's not too much we need to change there in terms of our process. I think where there is still work to do, work to be done and scope for optimization is looking at the financing and the funding and the way that the various actors work together to ensure that technology rolls out at pace. India is rapidly becoming the most populous country, the largest global economy, and will probably have experienced the greatest rise in meat consumption, or maybe just more simply protein consumption. So I think the need for how we see this at scale is what has to be optimized. And I think to boil it down to what I think has to happen is we need to see some of those investment dollars that are definitely, we've seen it in cultured meat. We're seeing it in the GFI report of best part of $1 billion into fermentation. Right now, it's all happening in North America, some in Europe. I think what has to happen is we need to see some of the concentration of investment dollars working through the complete ecosystem to see capacity going on the ground. But there's no obstacles towards it, and I think it does create that low-cost solution.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And Taylor, we're describing a future where a lot of these high-quality alternative proteins, like Abunda mycoprotein or biomilks, breast milk, are available widely, highly functional, price competitive with the cheapest commodity proteins on the market. But as Michelle said earlier, plant-based proteins are kind of there already, right? We're not using the broad spectrum, this rainbow of possible options that we should be using. There's a lot of work that has to go into that. But to a certain extent, we're there, where it's more on the horizon immediately, as is fermentation than, let's say, cultivated breast milk, right? I would say the main question that currently exists about nutrition and plant-based protein, let's say plant-based meats, is this kind of false dichotomy about whether the plant-based burgers that are being formulated to replace animal beef burgers are healthy. What would you say to people that are making these kinds of arguments? Because this is quite, it's coming to a head currently with people having these discussions globally.
Yeah, so I think it's a very politicized question right now, and there's a lot of different types of organizations asking these questions. But I think anytime you're making comparison between one product and another, between two categories, it's important to ask, like, healthy compared to what, right? Healthy exists on a relative scale. And so, if you're comparing a plant-based burger to, a fresh bowl of chickpeas and lentils and wheat and whole grain wheat, maybe not as healthy. But if you're comparing a plant-based burger to maybe an ultra processed product full of non-natural ingredients, maybe then a plant-based burger is really healthy. So I think it's a question of, what are you comparing it to? And that requires some really deep research on what are people eating today, right? And really, what is the food basket that you're comparing it to? And I think an important component to this, Varun, that we don't often talk about enough in this space is that the landscape of malnutrition in most of the places that, at least for me, that I work, and including in India, it looks different than it did 30 or 40 years ago. It's no longer just the idea of the stunted, skinny child that is the face of malnutrition. Malnutrition today also means rampant obesity rates, rampant diabetes rates in more so developing countries around the world. You look at the rates in Nigeria, in India, in Brazil, in countries that are middle income and that are transitioning away from maybe more unprocessed diets towards processed diets. That double burden of malnutrition is really the reality that I see in my work today. And so, one of the things that I really try to pride myself on as I work in different countries is really to really understand the unique landscape in a place. And one kind of weird specific example is that in Liberia, for example, we knew that malnutrition was bad in kids and especially in girls. What we had no idea was, and what took actually doing the nutrition research to figure out, was that almost more importantly than really high malnutrition rates in urban Liberia was chronic dehydration rates of not boys, but of young girls. Because what we found was that in urban settings in Liberia, girls did not have access to toilets and therefore were not consuming almost any water or other liquids throughout the day. And therefore that was leading to really chronic dehydration. So I give that antidote to say that when we look at what malnutrition means, the kind of classic idea of a starving child, it's much more nuanced than that in our modern age. And therefore the products that we as food industry professionals are taking to market, our products need to be as nuanced as the people we're serving. And one quick other point on that, I work in countries like Liberia and Congo, both in Central West Africa, similar agricultural crops growing, but the malnutrition landscape is completely different. Because of a bunch of different factors, but we didn't just assume, hey, what we did in Liberia is going to work in Congo. We said, hey, let's kind of start from scratch and really analyze, like, what is the malnutrition landscape here? What are the nuances? And then, maybe a plant-based burger is the right product that fits within the nuances of that diet.
Yeah, thank you. And the point about the double or the triple duty burden of malnutrition is very well said. And I think, this is an anecdote I say all the time, but if you go and talk to, let's say, the Tata Trusts, which operate in India and do fantastic work across all areas of development, they'll tell you that speaking to a family of 4 in an urban slum, that family will tell you that they eat 1 mutton or goat meal a week for 460 rupees. And if they could afford to eat 2 mutton meals a week for 920 rupees, then they would, right? It brings people together. It's a symbol of status and it's tasty. That's what, to a certain extent people want to eat. So there's many Indias within India. Like you said, Taylor, it depends on the different cohorts, what's going on for each group. But yeah, I think that there's a lot to consider. We can't have these simplistic answers for everything. Jim, actually to that point, the facility that you're putting up in Europe is really fascinating. It's going to be this mega production facility, as you said, for Abunda mycoprotein. One of the major questions people have about this kind of controlled environment agriculture is, are different models possible? Can we get some nuanced models like decentralization perhaps? Can we do fermentation at a very small scale in markets like India, where perhaps you don't have logistics infrastructure with one mega facility to then transport that protein around the country? Will we be able to hit those points for these different kinds of models during this decade?
I think my honest view is, on current trajectory, we're not going to see any fully decentralized model in this decade that also realizes the same of low cost. In Europe, we're building this capacity, which is 10,000 tons, and the first plant is supported by a flagship project funded by the EU's bio-waste industries, and we're massively grateful to them. And I'd say our plan is to grow from that site to 50,000 tons. I think I'm sharing a screen. On the left-hand side, we show a picture of that's the facility there, and it's going to grow in scale. So 50,000 tons, and if we were to guesstimate of the population within about 100 miles of that site, then I think it's well in excess of 10 million. So if you do the math, that gives us 5 kilograms per person in Europe in that perimeter, and which is up to 10% of their annual protein consumption, and it can be achieved with these low costs. We think this model is adequately decentralized, and one which gives us, when replicated, lets us produce protein that have scale and impact. I guess the alternative concept model is, can we see this kind of thing on the right-hand side, which would be something really, really local and decentralized? I think it's got challenges, and I think within your question you say this controlled environment, and I think the first obligation of any food is to be safe, and so safety comes first, and then nutritious and delicious come right behind. And I think the whole piece of and within making mycoprotein or controlled fermentation, it does make massively safe food, and it does so by making sure that the process is very clean and very precise. I don't think it's jumping to the right-hand side. I think where our future is in this decade, and probably I'll categorize it within this decade, is these high-scale protein factories, thousands of tons. So 10s, 50, our module capacity is 10,000 tons. And I think that once you get to 50, then 50,000 tons, it makes sense of move that 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers closer to the next source of food crop, and closer to the next community. But I don't think it's going to be the real microbrewery decentralized model that we might see, because I think that doesn't give the economics and efficiency, which is part of the question as well. We have to get to that low cost, otherwise we miss the point.
I just quickly Googled how many towns in India with more than 1 million people, and we have about 50 today, 50. And I would bet that in 2030 we'll have more than that. So I think that all makes sense, Jim. I think the idea is to have different. We need all tools, I think is the way that we describe it. We need all tools across these three pillars that make sense. Whether it's plant-based in rural communities, or whether it's thinking about if there's a catchment area of those rural communities that can support the advent of such a production platform that you're putting up as well. I think we need all tools to really advance nutritional status.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. Taylor, a similar question, and we're going to get to the operating models you described earlier, right? The Kawada Farms Power Gari project, the cassava porridge, which looks so good, by the way. You worked on setting
it's
up.
Very good.
You worked on setting up operating models that made sense for the local terrain and the population distribution. So could you tell us about that work, and particularly how you tweaked those initial plans to be more fit for local purpose?
Yeah, so I think when we think about smart protein or food tech, we think that the final product has to be full of technology. The way we try to think about our work is that there should be a whole bunch of technology, a whole bunch of innovation in the process to get to that final product. But the final product, and in our case, the final production site, actually might be incredibly low tech and to your point, Varun, fit for purpose in the context. So what that meant in the context of Northern Liberia was we took some of the world's top equipment engineers and faced them with the challenge of, hey, can we design a fully food safe production facility that can be built and maintained by motorcycle mechanics in northern Liberia, because what we found when we looked at the landscape was that any kind of equipment knowledge in northern Liberia, and even tools to repair equipment and things, what was had at motorcycle repair shops. And so we designed our facility based completely around how do you design something that a motorcycle repair mechanic can understand, can fix. So that was one thing. And so we did that. And therefore we built all our machines in Liberia, and then we're able to build a facility for a couple $1,000s, which was a great end kind of benefit of that too. The other crazy question that we asked was, hey, what is the cheapest cost of energy? Because it's assumed, in most places in India today, for example, that the cost of power is generally cheaper than the cost of human power. That's right, the cost of electricity is cheaper than the cost of human power. When we looked deeply at the economics of a place like northern Liberia, or maybe if you're looking at more rural parts of India, we found that that's actually not yet true. That when you did the math of looking at time for energy blackouts, amount of time it is required to wait for energy systems to come back on or offline, we found that paying people and running a facility based on human power was actually cheaper than using electricity. So therefore we designed a facility that was off the grid. All of our machines operate based on some sort of hand cranking system, which means that you can generate your product whether the electricity grid is operating or not operating. So that's the context of Liberia. In Congo, again, everything is off the grid, not for sustainability reasons, but for economic reasons. It's cheaper to run. In Congo, we have right now 16 production facilities. The projects, my partner is the World Food Program. I'm working as a consultant on it. And they're now producing 70,000 food products every month in central Congo. So all done by hand, right? But we just started production in September, and 70,000 snack bars were produced, right? So yes, not millions of pieces of product, but pretty freaking impressive for a completely hand produced product. So I think when we think about scale, when we think about technology, we need to challenge ourselves to get beyond the idea that that has to only mean a really high tech facility built with really world-class equipment in the typical way we do, but ask how we can apply technology in just a whole bunch of different settings.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. It's fascinating. And I think there is an underlying tension. We've talked about how famously extrusion capacity is a bottleneck in the Indian plant-based meat sector, and other technologies that can still give us, whether it's fermentation or whether it's even mechanical processing, food processing technologies that can give us similar results for plant-based meats that are out there, that are in the brains of someone that we haven't yet figured out, that are fit for purpose locally. I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking to think about over the next decade. Michelle, over the next decade, there will be many moral panics about technology. I think that's a given in any decade. But these moral panics about what the technology is going to do to us, etc., can disadvantage those who need these solutions the most from accessing them. So how can alternative protein innovators like you, looking to target problems like malnutrition, work with incumbents, regulators, and consumers to give these foods a sensible path to market that doesn't stifle innovation?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with consumers in your list of people, because I think consumers drive much more of the decision making that happens in technology and food than we understand or know. And so I think two examples that are really interesting. One, we're doing consumer interviews with a lot of moms right now, which we put out a global call for anyone who wants to have a chat with us. Sign up on our website, and we would love to hear about your breastfeeding journey and challenges. And so I got to talk to a mom just outside of New Delhi last week and hear about the challenges. She's an organic farmer and runs her family business, and just had her first son about 6 months ago, and had an incredible, beautiful experience breastfeeding him, but wasn't confident she was making enough milk. And was also concerned, she lives with her mother-in-law and father-in-law, which is horrifying to me here in the United States. I think to myself, I could never do that. But for you all, I'm proud of you that you can tolerate your in-laws better than I can. But she was saying that it's really, really hard to know if she had produced enough milk, and that she was getting, an incredible amount of pressure from her in-laws to feed her son infant formula in addition, to make sure that he was getting enough nutritionally. And she said one of the most beautiful things, which was that breastfeeding is a fundamental human experience that's the same on every continent. Like, I know that what I'm experiencing looks identical in many ways to a mom sitting in San Francisco. And that is both incredibly heartwarming and makes me feel really comfortable, and terrifying that we still live in a world where we're having that experience on opposite sides of it, where you're not sure if you're making enough, or you're not sure what technical solutions you need. And so I think, especially for our technology in breast milk, where we're finally applying technology to women's health, to infant nutrition, to spaces that have been woefully underinvested in and under-discussed, consumers have a lot of power. Mothers and parents have a lot of power. And so by demanding better options, by pushing companies, by pushing regulators, by pushing industries to say, hey, I don't want to use powdered milk and vitamins, or I don't want to use porridge and flour mixtures. I want better nutritional options for my kids because they're our future generation. We will see more change and more motion. And we've already seen that in other parts of plant-based sectors. I mean, we're already seeing interesting and fascinating consumer shifting that occurs in the industry by just consumers demanding more of what they want. And so I think when you look at companies, back to your question of like, how do we work with incumbents? How do we work with regulators? Incumbents see this. A lot of my work at Gates was looking at huge multinational companies who want ways to work on malnutrition, but don't really know the path forward and need someone to hand them a playbook because they're pretty risk averse and they're huge. So like Taylor saying, why don't we use equipment that's hand powered, would literally reduce them to tears to think about operating a manufacturing facility that didn't have electronic equipment. And so we have to be the ones to take that consumer understanding, to take those insights and be their advocates as these new players in the food industry and say, we know what consumers want. Here's the playbook that we all need to follow. And we need to use the scale of large incumbents to get it to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And that, I think, especially for the cellular agriculture sector, is going to be hard because a lot of us are growing these companies, no pun intended, like our babies. And it's really hard to think about, in order to reach the appropriate scale to get to the most people, we're all going to have to let go a little bit and make sure that we're actually leveraging this global supply chain that already exists in food. And regulators see it, they know it.
Sorry, I hate to cut you off, but actually I have to get myself really quickly ready for the keynote with Indra right after this. But I want to say, I'm so sorry, but we're actually running out of time. So I want to say thank you to Jim, Taylor, and Michelle across all the alternative protein pillars of fermentation, plant-based, and cellular agriculture. Thank you so much for your time. We're really excited for what you are doing and going to do for malnutrition, to target malnutrition over the next decade. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and good luck with Indra.
Thank you. Take care.